And so at last we come to the work of Claire Wardle herself and her really important thoughts and analysis on the nature of fake news, what it is and what it does. And Claire Wardle is an extremely interesting, gifted media practitioner with significantly with roots in a really solid, well-developed academic background. She has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, the Annenberg School for Communication. I believe she did a lot of her early journalism studies, published research on things like coverage of child abuse cases in the United Kingdom and the way that the problem of child abuse was affected by how news media covered that issue. And then she's gone on, she's now chief executive, I believe, of an organization called First Draft, which is kind of a think tank, provider of education and information on how societies can really protect themselves from the confusion caused by digital information creation and gathering. So she does super important applied research on how citizens and democracies can avoid some of the pitfalls of societies where we rely on digital media for information in a context where that digital media is pretty easy to manipulate. So I'm going to go through some of her ideas on what fake news is and the different forms of fake news, and in terms of the way that they really muddy the relationship between facts and truth. As we talk about fake news in terms of that horrible phrase, the alternative fact, the idea that you kind of make your own facts up. But one of the things that's most notable about her work, of course, is that we know historically that the relationship between facts, history, and the truth are related but different. And equally, one of the things that Claire Wardle writes about in her work on memes is that truth is important, but it isn't the whole problem. And in her later work, she talks about the political power of memes. These are images, playful images, which are set out to represent themselves as jokes, but actually communicate really, really important and powerful political ideas. Partly because they're visual, partly because they're supposed to be funny, and partly because they can argue that they aren't arguments at all. The example that I'm showing you here is a famous meme that was retweeted by Donald Trump. And the meme features him hitting a golf ball and then another video clip of a golf ball hitting Hillary Clinton in the back and she falls over. And many people thought that this was really incredibly misogynistic act on the behalf of the president. He retweeted a tweet that basically showed him assaulting a woman that we know he didn't like. And of course he said, well, that's not true at all. It's just a joke. It's just funny. It didn't really happen. And I didn't make the meme. I retweeted it. So one of the reasons why memes are interesting is that they become examples of how political communication becomes a matter of manipulating people emotionally through arguments that aren't arguments at all. They don't make any truth claims whatsoever. So in terms of the meme, the reason why the meme becomes such an important part of political argument is because it's a political form which has a deniability in it. It's an argument that you can claim isn't an argument at all. But let's go back to fake news and the question of how does fake news invent traditions? Well, one of the things that Wardle does is makes this really important distinction between disinformation and misinformation, but then talks interestingly about how digital media environments often see the two kinds of fake news working together. So disinformation is pretty close to the definition of black propaganda that we encountered earlier on. So this is deliberately misleading information which an agent deliberately places in order to mislead the public. And we've seen a recent example of this, or we've seen allegations of a recent example of this in some of the anti-lockdown protests in places like Michigan that happened in April of 2020. And there were allegations that these protests, which really pressurized local governors to lift COVID-19 restrictions. There was an argument that these were being largely orchestrated by far right-wing groups who are generally hostile to any form of government intervention in individual liberties. And there was this idea that these protests, the allegation was these protests were being organized by these particular groups to gather popular support for their own political agenda. So a lot of people who were going along to anti-lockdown demonstrations were in fact also supporting a cause of anti-state intervention that's typically driven by far right groups. And the argument was that these far right groups were using online crowdsourcing to promote real life participation in these protests, thus furthering their own agenda. So the idea was that this is disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation occurs when people unwittingly share messages which are false. You see this quite often all the time about people who get very upset about privacy restrictions, privacy issues on Facebook, and kind of share news about privacy violations that aren't happening at all, that sort of thing. Now, this would be an example of, so the argument is that there's the allegation that anti-lockdown protests were organised online through disinformation, but then protesters who did not share these right-wing agendas, who also passed on notices about these anti-lockdown protests. This was an example of misinformation, of creating networks of gossip that are based on false facts. Now, the other interesting thing about Wardle's work, however, is that she contextualizes this new form of political persuasion, this new form of black propaganda, I guess, within some philosophies and ways of regarding the impact of media technologies that have been around for a while. And particularly we see Wardle's work emerging from an anti-technological determinist point of view. And she talks about the fact that social media, one of the fake news emerges from the unanticipated consequences of social media practices, which have nothing to do with the technologies themselves and everything to do with existing human foibles and traits. So she says the problem with fake news is very much, it does emerge from a design fault in social media, but this design fault is really based more on the philosophy of social media entrepreneurs. Social media entrepreneurs imagined that sharing, the capacity to share information, could only be a good thing. And one of the things that we see with fake news is that's not the case. So the quote is, social media entrepreneurs, fail to see how technology would not change who we are fundamentally. It could only map onto existing human characteristics. And so she says, well, it's really impossible to view fake news as an exclusively technological kind of phenomenon, because it's driven by a range of things outside of media technologies. One is uncertain political times. We live in a period of great chaos, great uncertainty, climate change, the rise of populism, all of these sorts of things. And we can only connect the way that fake news operates with the uncertainties and the desires and the ambitions that those historical social circumstances create. And that fake news is also driven by our desires for meaning, certainty, and quick and easy answers. And of course, the other idea is that algorithms didn't anticipate malicious intent. And one of the things that we saw particularly, for example, was the way that the Christchurch shootings were driven by a murderer who was very much persuaded of and skilled in the art of the meme. So when people were talking about, so when social media entrepreneurs imagined the power of creation and sharing via digital media, the very last person they were imagining were the Christchurch murderer. But that's what we've got, because we have to understand that fake news emerges not just from technology, but from the existing historical political tensions that those technologies address. Now, the solution that Wardle offers is that basically we need to become more savvy as media users. We need to develop the muscle, is the phrase that's used. Is we need to develop the techniques, and we need to practice what it means to recognize fake news when we see it. And we need to be highly aware of what fake news is represented by. But of course, this raises an interesting question, because do you think this is the best way of solving the situation? Are there other ways of solving the situation? For example, should there be more of a focus on regulation? What are some of the limitations of passing the problem of fake news on to the user? Now, I should mention this is not what Wardle does. This is one of her solutions. But the other problem that I'm going to suggest is that another reason why fake news is old news in some ways, another reason why it taps into existing issues that media scholars are interested in, is the reality of social media giants that are difficult to regulate means that at the present moment in history, we tend to think of fake news as something which is primarily a problem for the media user, something which the media user has to learn to fight for herself, and that kind of follows in another historical trend in media, which is the move toward deregulation and the move toward shoving the burden for media management onto media users, towards saying, look, it's up to you to protect yourself in this media environment. And there are problems with that, which I'll return to in my concluding remarks. But what I want you to do right now is note down your evaluations of Wardle's argument for how media users can protect themselves against fake news. How realistic do you think this solution is?